We've had hard acts to follow. We've also covered a lot of territory. We've already gotten to some of the things that this panel was intending to cover. Title of the panel is What Can African Nations Do to Increase Trade and Investment? We've had some prescriptions that have been put out already, but I think there are some other things worth covering. And we have a very interesting group of people. We've got two technologists, we've got a government expert, and we have a lawyer who has a fascinating nonprofit to talk about, and I can't wait to get to Gary. But we're going to start with the technologists, and we'll leap right into it. We've talked today about infrastructure, the need for African trade, trans-African trade. We've talked about education, empowering women, but what we'd like to do, if we can, and I ask the panelists to think of it in these terms, is can we talk about a few prescriptions? Are there some specific things to do or to avoid that might actually really increase trade? And starting with technology, I'd like to call on Matthew Reisman from Microsoft. And Matthew, the question I've got for you is, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, the need for ports and roads and the basics there, but we also have hinted, at least, about the power of technology, and specifically how we use technology in banking, how we use it in transactional networks, and how we use it to communicate things like prices. What is the importance of bandwidth? If you had your way running any one of these African nations, what would you do in the way of bandwidth, and why is it important?
So thank you very much. I mean, just before the break, as I mentioned, I had the great privilege of speaking with each of you and your tables about the extraordinary benefits that technology is bringing in so many of your countries, and some of the ways you've discussed, James, relating to financial inclusion, democracy building, just agricultural development, all these extraordinary benefits. But it's not just the technology, it's the ability to move data. It's the data that powers these technologies. So much of our economy these days is powered by data flows. For many of us, we think of it as the real currency of the 21st century economy. Just to sort of crystallize the enormity of this new phenomenon, there was a report that I'd recommend to you that was put out in March of this year by McKinsey, which is a consultancy that many of you know, that they did a study that found between 2005 and 2014, global data flows grew by 45 times, much faster than the pace of trade in goods or even financial flows. And they also tried to estimate the contribution of these data flows to growth of GDP over that decade, and they estimated that these data flows added $2.8 trillion to our global economy, which is an extraordinary figure when you think about it. But there was another report this year from the World Bank, their Global Development Report, which focused on digital dividends, but it also talked about digital divides. And this is something we talked about in each of our groups, about how in many of your countries, and frankly in our country too, there are divides based on gender, there are divides based on wealth in terms of people's ability to access technology. A big piece of that gap is lack of access to bandwidth and connectivity. Some of you spoke about how in your countries data is terribly expensive if you can't access it, or there are villages, rural places where it's not accessible at all. So in the area of prescriptions, what can we do to do better? Governments can have policies that allow dynamic uses of spectrum. Our company is proud to be trying to innovate, along with many others, in finding new ways to bring connectivity to people who have been previously cut off. So for example, in countries where we can, we're using unused portions of the TV spectrum, broadcast spectrum, to send cheap and affordable bandwidth to rural areas. We're doing this in Kenya, we're doing this in parts of Botswana and South Africa and Ghana, but policy has to enable that. There also need to be policies towards technology in general that don't put up barriers to trade and investment in high quality technology products. For example, To move that data, there has to be ICT equipment and setting up base stations, which we talked about in many of your countries. These technologies can be expensive, but only more so if there are higher import duties, for example. So having an open policy toward trade and investment, in fact, enables more connectivity as well.
Thank you. So next I'd like to call on Michael DiPaula-Coyle from IBM. And I warned Michael about 2 minutes ago that I was going to give him a surprise question. And this really arose out of some of the issues that were raised in the roundtables, issues that were raised this morning. And it struck me that if we're here with technology people, we ought to ask them a tough question. And the issue is this. It's the issue of property rights and land ownership. And some of you may be familiar with Hernando de Soto's work, the Peruvian economist, who's written what is a landmark work about the power of land ownership, allowing people to own their own land and how it can improve an economy. And one of the restraints in Africa and many parts of the undeveloped parts of the globe to land ownership is the physical restraint of going out and surveying land and finding out where it is and then creating records of who owns it. And it struck me, and I posed the question to Michael, I'd like to hear him answer it, is why can't we use GPS mapping and digital databases to do what was done with paper and massive file cabinets in the previous century?
So I think it's a great question. I would just want to, before I get to that, reinforce what my colleague Matthew was talking about, which is the power of data and how data really is going to transform industries in every sector of the economy. And continents like Africa have an opportunity to effectively leapfrog technology using data. And Microsoft, IBM, many of the big companies that are US-based are investing billions of dollars in places like Africa to ensure that data-driven innovation is available to all countries, irrespective of where they are in terms of development. As part of that, segueing into your question, data also has the benefit. One of the benefits of data is transforming government services. And we see that in a lot of economies where you have, frankly, a history of corruption. You have history of governments not delivering on some of the basic services that you would expect a government to provide to citizens. Land, as you said, is a key, land ownership, and the records around land ownership has been a big problem. And I just want to actually point an example. India, I travel to India a lot. Land ownership in India has a very checkered history, in part because for decades, India relied on a paper-based system for land deeds. And a huge problem for subsistence farmers and those who didn't have powerful connections with the government was getting land registered with the government. And we see enormous amounts of corruption at the federal and state level because you basically had to pay officials to ensure that they were going to process your land registration deeds. And if you didn't pay, well, then you weren't going to be the owner of that land. Prime Minister Modi, and I would actually recommend everyone in this audience to look at what the new Prime Minister in India is doing around what he calls Digital India, taking data and technology and transforming the way that government services are delivered to the citizens. And one of the ways they're doing that is they're digitizing all of the land records in India, ensuring that every Indian citizen can apply for a deed for their property online. There is not going to be, you take away the middleman, the bureaucratic middleman, so to speak, who in the past served as an obstacle for the average person trying to get that deed. And again, using technology as a way to circumvent what really is a corrupt process, unfortunately. And all of this is going to depend on the diffusion of technology throughout an economy. And with governments, sometimes the diffusion of technology is a little slow. Governments are not always as quick as private sector and other groups in terms of adapting to the newest technology. So perhaps, I think, as you think about what is going to be needed moving forward the next 10 to 20 years in African development, governments are going to have to look to companies like Microsoft, IBM, and others to help them, again, transform the way government delivers services to its citizens.
Thank you, Michael. So we're very fortunate to have with us today Flory Leiser, who's the U.S. Trade Representative for Africa. And Flory, you probably have more experience than everybody else in this room combined, but it would be helpful when we talk about prescriptions, about policies. In what policy areas can African governments revise their policies to increase the probability and possibilities of trade with the U.S.?
So that's a great question. I am delighted to be here, and as a way of answering that question, I just want to say to the young people that are here, the leaders now and future leaders, that the kinds of policies that are put in place, that you may be the ones putting in place in the very near future, are really critical for Africa to have the enabling environment for trade and investment. Investors can go anywhere in the world, and even as they look at the 55 countries of Africa, they have a lot of choices about where they can go. So some of the policy areas that are critical for attracting the investment that's needed and spurring the kind of trade that has to happen amongst Africans first, trading with each other and then with the rest of the world, are areas where the United States has been a proponent through things like the eligibility criteria for the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It's no accident that we're focused on market-based economy, rule of law, the support of international workers' rights, addressing things that have to do with child labor, protecting intellectual property. These are all areas where, if Africa is going to be able to be more than just a supplier to the world of raw commodities, and you're really going to take your place in the global economy and be able to produce and manufacture value-added processed goods, then those areas that I just touched on have to be addressed. A couple of other areas that we are focusing on through a program we call Trade Africa have to do with meeting global standards for agricultural products as well as industrial products. And all across Africa, there are many different standards for products, which makes it more difficult to trade with each other. So harmonizing your regulatory systems that put in place the kind of standards that are needed for agricultural products, for your industrial products, is also very critical. And one area that Tony Carroll touched on earlier that is also critical is trade facilitation. I don't know about you all, but I've had the opportunity to visit borders where, for at least, a mile, sometimes two, you've got trucks lined up trying to get across the border, days to get through the border, and then they get to the other side and days more to get all the paperwork done. This is having a tremendous and negative impact on Africa's competitiveness. All those days of products sitting there means that somebody's losing money. It means that it costs more to deliver those goods. So trade facilitation and putting in place the customs procedures, the regulatory procedures that make it easy to trade amongst Africans, getting those goods from the ports into landlocked countries. There's so many landlocked countries in Africa. So this is also important. Protecting intellectual property. I just want to use one example of that from the African side. People always talk about, well, that helps those developed countries and their businesses. But you think about Nollywood, and somebody was telling me years ago that industry would be so much more profitable. It's already profitable, but it would be so much more profitable if they did not have to worry about people basically stealing their movies and, you know, selling it to folks on, at reduced prices. That really undermines the integrity of what they bring to the screen and in filmmaking. And that's not just for Nigeria, but just around the continent. You just have to think about that. You think about music. You think about areas where Africa has the intellectual property and where it's not protected. And this is also important. And then the last thing that I would mention is the area of labor standards and protecting the environment. You know, when investors think about going to a country, even when they say, okay, we have to decide between going to a country in Asia, Latin America, or in Africa, they want to go someplace where there's respect for the rights of workers, where the labor standards are not low but high, because low labor standards, that doesn't help Africans either. And also protecting the environment. This becomes important because there's a high cost for those businesses that go in and say they have to provide their own water sanitation systems, et cetera. So these are areas, if you're going sort of, you know, what are the prescriptions, there are a number of these areas that are really important. And then the last thing that I would just mention is that, you know, when you think about the fact that Africa today, it's amazing to me, still accounts for only 3% of all world trade. I mean, like, how could that be? You know, with everything you have in terms of natural resources and then your human resources, and you're sort of like, how could it be? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you are at the lowest end of the global value chains in pretty much everything that you're producing and exporting to each other in the world, and you ship out, you know, your raw copper and then import, you know, copper piping. You ship out your cotton. You import, you know, other products in that value chain. It's just very important that all of you think about what are the opportunities for value-added agriculture, for producing and being competitive in the global economy and supplying what the rest of the world needs. And this is where we think that the U.S. and both companies and government can really work with you in building the capacity that's needed to be competitive in a 21st century global economy.
Thank you, Flory. Gary Slayman is a partner at Morgan Lewis, a global law firm, and also happens to be a very good friend of mine. One of the first picks for the panel. So, but Gary's also involved in a nonprofit, and Gary, we talk about the need for education, and when we, I think everybody in this room, and you talk, you know what it would mean to have an educated workforce. We assume you're talking about, well, we need better schools in your African country. We need to educate more of our own citizens. Gary has another approach, or an additive approach, and I'd love for you to talk about that, Gary.
Please. Thank you, Jim. And thank you to the presidential precincts. Through my friendship with Jim, I've had the benefit of participating in a number of these programs and meeting a number of the fellows. And it's just a tremendous opportunity for me to meet you all, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So let me just give you a little context. I was at the UN for the first time for me on Monday, presenting on a discussion that it was a business mechanism. It was businesses coming to the UN to talk about the importance of migration for economic development. And there's a global forum for migration and development that's tied into the goals that the UN has set for 2030 for economic development worldwide. But what the businesses are saying is we need the opportunity to move labor, skilled labor around the globe. And it's difficult. It's difficult for a company to do inter-company transfers. It's difficult to move economic migrants, and the program that I'm going to speak to a bit that I'm involved with has to do with refugee populations, and those are even more difficult to move. But the point is that the flow of human capital is difficult because of immigration laws, local immigration laws. And this conversation at the UN was really, what do we do to enhance economic development through the ability to move talent around the globe efficiently? And so the group I'm involved with is called Talent Beyond Boundaries. And the premise here from the founders is that among the refugee areas, and we're starting in the areas around Lebanon and Jordan, the large population, almost 5 million refugees in those areas, including Turkey, that are displaced by the Syrian conflict. Among that population, there's a highly skilled workforce there that has been displaced. And they're lost to business, they're lost to the economy, they are not able to practice their skills, contribute to global development. And yet there are huge skills gaps. Floria has described, I think, that in Africa there are businesses that would come, but one of the barriers they face is filling skills gaps that would encourage them to come. Not that the native population isn't critical to contributing to the business, but there may be skills that that population doesn't have. And this refugee population would come. I mean, we've done focus groups with them, we've met with them. I mean, they will travel in order to be useful and employ their professions. And so the premise behind Talent Beyond Boundaries is to identify, and we've deployed software in, an app. Thankfully, they have cell phones, they have capacity. So we have a link that these people can fill out their prior employment, their skill sets, their language skills, certifications, so we can identify them. My job, frankly, is to link them to businesses around the globe, frankly, not the US, not Europe, but other places around the globe that have more open immigration systems that would welcome these skills into the country. And I raise it here as a policy question for you all, the young leaders, to consider, because I think native populations have an instinctual negative reaction to the idea that you would bring in foreigners into your country to work when you have unemployment and your own people you're trying to employ. And yet study after study after study, and I'll quote one, there's an Oxford study that studied Uganda, which had a more open set of laws. They permitted refugees to work in Uganda. And the economic benefits, both in hiring Ugandans into these businesses that were created by the refugees, by the amount of goods that the refugees bought from Ugandan businesses because they set up these businesses, was very favorable, and in fact reduced significantly social payments and other things for that population. So you see models where open immigration systems create economic value for the country, and yet politically it's an enormously difficult challenge for policymakers in any country. I mean, you just had to listen to the Republican convention yesterday and the messaging from Mr. Trump. It's a challenge, but the studies will show that the economic benefits are great.
Thank you, Gary. So we're going to go to questions in just a minute, but we've spent all day talking about things to do, prescriptions. And I'd like to, real quickly, a little lightning round down the panel here, say, if you were going to go to do business in Africa, in the country, what is the one thing that would keep you from going? Why would you not go? What would be going on there that would prevent you from doing business in a country in Africa? You want to start, Michael? Yeah, Matthew, I'm sorry. Sorry, Matthew.
I'll try to be fast as lightning, but you may not like my answer in that there's never one factor, because it is always contingent on a group of factors. I mean, I will say we've talked a lot about the rule of law today. That is a really fundamental condition that underlies every other condition in terms of creating an enabling environment for business, justice systems that work. I just wanted to mention that there is, when we think about where to invest, we do think about connectivity. We think about the skills base of the population, both as consumers and as innovators for helping us create products. We think about having a strong policy environment, not only on trade and investment, which is absolutely essential, that open environment, but also smart rules on data protection and smart rules on cybersecurity as well. So it's a combination.
Thank you. Michael, one thing that would keep you from doing business in a country in Africa?
Well, I'll add everything what Matthew said. As future policymakers, I would say that the biggest challenge we see often in emerging economies is the lack of regulatory predictability and regulatory transparency. That, to me, is one of the top priorities for any government to get a grip on. That is what, for a company like IBM that operates in 170 plus countries, without that predictability, I have seen it firsthand. Our company makes decisions about withdrawing investments, deferring investments, cutting back on investments. So as you think about that as future policymakers, that's absolutely crucial.
Lori?
I think poor leadership and lack of vision. I think that the countries in Africa where you have good leadership and a clear vision about how the country needs to be linked to its regional partners and the rest of the world. And where you see strong leadership on that, then they drive the kinds of regulations and policies that are put in place. They have, good relationships with their own private sector. They put in place policies that are inviting to foreign businesses and investors. And so I would just say that strong visionary leadership is the thing that I think, when lacking, has a huge impact on Africa.
Gary?
I'll put on my working as a partner in one of the largest law firms in America and one of the larger ones in the world with over 2,000 lawyers. Partly it's just self-serving, but I would say rule of law is important. I mean, as at my practice, I need to have laws to interpret that I can depend on. Lack of corruption, certainty of the regulatory process. I think that will both bring, for my business, clients, but it also gives us an important aspect of how do you manage a business in country and what can you depend on as you do it.
Very good. So we'll open the floor to questions. We'll start here.
Well, my name is Frederick Fusi from Tanzania. I'm having a question to Flosry on the role of international investors and who are investing in Africa. For so long, if you look at the balance of trade in most of the African countries, they run the negative balance of trade. And many of African nations import more than what they export more. So my question is, what is the role of the investors in terms of building competitive capacity of local manufacturing industries in relation to foreign direct investment? As all we know that foreign direct investment has a very significant role in African countries, but also it has been taking away a lot of money through illicit financial flows. So what do you think is the role of the investors in building competitive capacity in local manufacturing? Thank you.
Who would like to start? Flori, you want to answer that?
So I guess the first thing that I would say is lots and lots of countries have negative trade balances. I mean, you can't use the trade balance as the only barometer of whether or not a country is doing well in terms of trading and investing with others. We have a negative trade balance with China, but there's still a lot of investment into China. There's still a lot of trade with China. So I would just encourage you to look at the full picture. You really cannot use the balance of trade as the only thing. You have to look at what is the mix of products that are being imported and exported, where are the areas where the country is competitive. And just to use as an example, in the United States, we don't produce leather shoes anymore. For the most part, we don't produce apparel anymore. But the fact that we import, I don't even think we make televisions anymore in the United States. But clearly, the fact that we import all of those kinds of things into the U.S. economy doesn't mean that the U.S. economy is not vibrant and isn't growing, isn't producing jobs that pay good wages. So I think Africa has to look more broadly at that, and including services. I touched on goods earlier, but services trade is obviously a very important. Financial services, distribution services, telecom services in these areas these gentlemen were talking about. And in terms of increasing capacity to be competitive, you know, I think outsiders can absolutely do that. We have any number of programs and initiatives in the U.S. that are contributing to Africa's competitiveness, building infrastructure, whether it's MCC or USAID programs that are focused on facilitating trade in the region, regional trade, helping countries to take advantage of AGOA. But at the end of the day, I think that the commitment by the leadership, again, to see what the value is of people like yourselves, what you bring, what the opportunities are, and fostering an environment that supports you and your capacity to be competitive in your businesses that you're forming, that's just as critical, maybe even more, than what your bilateral partners like the United States do with and for you. But we are definitely your partners in building capacity, and you know, think that Africa has not even begun to sort of touch its maximum capacity in that area. The figure I used earlier of accounting for 3% of world trade, clearly we know Africa can do much more than that.
Thank you, Flory. Question over here.
Thank you so much for the discussions and debate. Hearing from you, it feels like there is a lot to be fixed before we say that we have a friendly business environment in Africa, taking into account the transportation, border issues, power, technology, data access. My question is, by the way, I'm Jeline from Tanzania. My question is, where exactly should we start? Or what one thing should we start fixing automatically will give us a space to fix others? Because if I take into account fixing all this problem at once with the capacity and with the level of our economy, probably will be difficult to build the transportation all over Africa just like this. And we can't wait for more than 100 years to come. Like, where should we start? Or what one thing that we should start with? Thank you.
So let me answer that question, and I'll explain why I chose myself in a minute. First of all, we went down the line about what is the one thing that would keep you from doing business in Africa, and I think what I heard was rule of law, regulatory environment that you could rely upon, trade that was reliable. So that may be one answer to your question. But you also started off by saying we talked about all the things that were wrong. And perhaps we've made a mistake in that regard, because there's a lot right about Africa. There's a lot of very good things going on there, a tremendous amount of promise, which is why we're all here. And I'm in the venture capital business. We invest in new businesses, in startups. And money is like water. It flows downhill. It goes to where it's welcome. So in any one of your African countries, if you create a new business and there's an environment there that allows our venture capital money, like mine, private banking money. One of my closest African friends is a woman who runs all of private equity banking for Barclays. And I know that Ntando will invest anywhere in Africa if she finds an entrepreneur with a good business that is making a profit, growing. Money will find its way to that person. And that is an iron law that works anywhere in the world. And Africa is not immune from that law. Africa should be the beneficiary of that law. Another question. Far back. Way back. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Lawn-Highland Banda from Zambia. A lot has been said about what African countries need to do in order to attract investment, but I always hear very little about what businesses do and the impact of businesses in Africa. My question is based on the human rights approach to business. Would businesses in the US be averse to the emerging model of carrying out a human rights impact assessment pre-investment? Thank you.
Who'd like to answer that?
I'll be glad to start. Only to say, welcome the question. I can only speak for the company I work for, Microsoft. I read your biographies before coming here, and one theme I noted was how many of you are such courageous champions of human rights across the continent, and I realized I needed to learn more about what my own company was doing in that area. And so what I wanted to encourage you to do was to have a look at the things I was reading last night. Microsoft's put a lot of effort in building our policy on human rights and to we have recognized as a company that technology can be used for good for fostering human rights. It can be also used to suppress it. And we've made a commitment wherever we work to try and make technology a tool to empower people towards fostering human rights. And if you go on our website, if you look for the Microsoft Statement on Human Rights, it's there. We're one of the founding members of what's called the Global Network Initiative, which is an effort fostered around freedom of expression online. So at least speaking for our company, it's something that we take very seriously everywhere we work.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. I think I see a lot of hands out there. I'm sorry we can't respond to more questions. I'm sure on the way out the door you can catch somebody and get your question answered. We're about to wrap up. We've got a few remarks to be said. I want to begin though, by thanking our panelists. It's been a very interesting day. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Thanks.
Thank you.